Good morning and a warm welcome to all of you on behalf of the Center on United States and Europe here at Brookings Institution Foreign Policy Program. My name is Aslı Aydın Taşbaş, and I will be moderating today's conversation on what's now shaping to be an incredibly important set of events over the past 48 hours following the elections for European Parliament. 27 EU member states went to the polls over 4 days last week. We're talking about 360 million eligible voters, half of which went to the polls to elect their representatives for a 720-seat European Parliament, the most important legislative body for Europe and within the EU. Now, on any normal news cycle, elections for the European Parliament hardly draw more attention than, say, Eurovision Song Contest. But these are not normal times. This is proving to be an incredibly important election. There is clearly a level of social and political upheaval around the world, and Europe is clearly not insulated from any of this. Elections are telling us that the radical lurch people had been fearing has not materialized, but there's a steady rise of the far right. Centrist groups have done really well, but still anti-immigrant, far right, anti-EU forces have gained roughly 130 seats, much better than they did. More importantly, of course, you've seen in the news that there's been a political earthquake in France with President Emmanuel Macron's party doing fairly poorly, and the far-right national rally led by Marine Le Pen and her protege Jordan Bardella doing fairly well with 31% of the vote. That is twice that of Macron's party, leading the French president to call for snap elections for the parliament. So there's a lot to unpack, including what's happening in Germany and on the Eastern periphery. And I have an excellent group of scholars here with me to talk about all of this. Constanza Stelzen-Miller is the director of the Center on the United States and Europe, CUSE, here at Brookings Institution, and she's the Fritz Stern Chair on Germany and Transatlantic Relations. Anna Grimawa-Busset is the non-resident fellow at Brookings, but she's joining us from Stanford, where she's a professor of political science. And Carlo Bastassin is joining us from Rome. He's our non-resident fellow at CUSE, but also a professor of European economic governance at Lewis University in Rome. So, Constanza, I'd like to start with you. You are in Germany. Tell us where you are. And was this a shock for you, the election results? What do you make of it? Give us your general overall reading of the results.
Sure. Thank you, and really happy to see everybody else here on this call, good friends and colleagues, for what is indeed an incredibly tense and exciting period in European politics. I, of course, am based in Washington, D.C. as director, but I'm a German national and travel here a lot, and that's what I'm doing currently. I'm in Bavaria near Munich. And our French colleague would have been the best person to explain what's going on in France. I'm a poor second best, but she's traveling as well, and I think on a panel as we speak. I think, as you say, the French national story here is the most exciting one of all of these elections. Just to explain to our American or non-European viewers, what has been elected here is the Parliament of the European Union, which has co-legislative powers in Europe. But these elections are run by national political parties and held by the member states. So they're always de facto also a referendum on incumbent governments. And the two governments that have been slapped particularly hard by their electorates are the French and the German governments. And the French government, as you say, Macron's party came in at half the votes that his opposition party, the far-right Rassemblement National, under Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella got. And he immediately called snap elections on June 30th and July 7th. And the way things are going now, that could lead to a far-right prime minister from July 7th, given the fact that there are a couple of important summits in Europe, especially the NATO anniversary summit in mid-July in Washington, D.C. There are G7 meetings. There are meetings about the future of Ukraine. Could be an incredibly important shift, even despite the fact that France has a presidential system that gives the president of the republic much greater powers than, say, especially in the shaping of foreign policy vis-a-vis his prime minister, than, say, you'd have in a parliamentary system like Germany. So there is I think those of us among our viewers who are interested in stocks and bonds will have noticed that there has been a fair amount of movement on French markets. There is also, I think, a real, earthquake going on in the French political scenery as parties debate possible coalitions. Macron was hoping to strike up a coalition with other centrist parties. His own party is center-right. He was hoping to strike up a coalition with the center-left and with the Les Républicains, who were to the right of him. And the leader of Les Républicains, Éric Ciotti, has just offered an alliance with Marine Le Pen. That, again, is leading to real turbulences within his party. There's at least one important European official, Michel Barnier, who's already protested against this. On the other hand, on the left, the left has, I think, already begun organizing itself into a coalition that would not include Macron's party, under the sort of working title of a Front Populaire, which, of course, carries all sorts of reminiscences of the 1930s. So a lot is going on in France, and some commentators have suggested that this might be a Cameron moment for Emmanuel Macron, suggesting, of course, or referencing, of course, the point in 2016 when Cameron called a referendum on Brexit, clearly in the assumption that he would win it. We will see what happens in France.
Constanza, you just scared me even a bit more than I felt over the weekend. There have been some commentary on social media and here and there in articles that said nothing to panic. There is, this pretty much the same composition in the European Parliament, the center holds. But as you point out, what's happening in France is nothing to overlook. Having possibly
You're right.
Right.
Let me perhaps specify something again for people who aren't as deeply in the weeds of European politics and institutions as we all are. At the European level, the center has held. So in other words, in the European Parliament, which has a voice in the selection of the next European executive, which includes the European Commission and its president, currently Ursula von der Leyen, who is up for reappointment or re-election, despite the winds of the far right in the European Parliament, there is still a stable centrist majority in the European Parliament. That will allow for some predictability and continuity and makes it likely that the center-right, to which Macron's party belongs, will have a significant role to play in the selection of the new commission, and the hard right has a much smaller vote. Again, there is a little bit of uncertainty there, and others may want to comment on that, in that there is a big new bloc of electors who aren't attached yet to one of the center-right or hard-right blocs. And depending on how coalition politics work out there might still be some surprises. But right now, we're heading for stability at the European level. But because the European Commission doesn't make the key decision in foreign and security policy, that's still done, right, by the Council, which is the heads of government sitting in conclave often discussing with the European Commission, also liaising with NATO. But there, it really matters what impact these elections have on the nation-state level. And it's very unusual that after a European Parliament election, a national head of state calls new elections. That's what's happened here in France, and it could have a destabilizing effect, not just on French politics, but also given the really quite extraordinarily forward-leaning role that Macron has recently elected to pursue, especially as regards support for Ukraine, that could make a real difference if a far-right prime minister is elected in the elections on July 7th.
So we're going to get to Ukraine, but thank you for this overview. I think it's impossible not to worry about the prospect of a far-right prime minister in France for the first time since World War II, and whether that changes the composition in the European Parliament or not, it's clearly indicative of a certain direction that French voters seem to want to go. And we have a piece from our colleague Tara Varma that's going to go up fairly soon. I think we have a piece from Constanza, a little bit of self-promotion here from Constanza that's going to go up on the Brookings website fairly soon, I think. But more importantly, for those of you that are not following the complicated architecture of EU governance, we have an explainer that Sophie Rosa and Tara Varma have written a couple of days ago, right before the European election, that talks about European Parliament, Commission, so Council of Europe, and so on and so forth, all the institutions, complicated institutions that make up Brussels, what it is. So, Carlo, I want to turn to you. You are in Rome, I presume. Before we go into the details of what's happening in Italy and the sort of fascinating new role for Giorgia Meloni, Italian Prime Minister, I wonder if you can share your basic takeaways, the top takeaways from the elections in terms of what it says about Europe and the dilemmas that are facing its institutions.
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure. It is a real pleasure discussing with you about this, in a way, dramatic elections. But I don't want to downplay the concern about the results of the European elections. But still, I would like to suggest that what is happening is not as incomprehensible as it may appear. And let me make it in the simplest possible terms. Consider the average European voter. He is around 48 years old. He began to vote in 1994 when he was 18, and the first 15 years of his political participation were exceptionally positive, favorable. There were years of optimism for economic development, global growth, and the political integration of Europe, the launch of the common currency. In the last 15 years, Europe's world and the voters' world has been turned upside down. Our average voter has lived through a global financial crisis, the deepest recession in living memory, a European crisis marked by a blame game between the European countries, the dramatic Syrian crisis, which produced an enormous flows of migrants, and in 2016, Brexit. Few years later, the common awareness of global climate change. In 2020, COVID-19 pandemic, followed by strong and anticipated inflation, and finally, the Russian military aggression on the eastern borders in 2022. All those crises changed the world that he had experienced in the former 15 years and seemed to arrive from beyond the borders. In response, a portion of the electorate has rejected various aspects of the status quo. Think of how many have expressed their opposition to globalization, no to the euro, no to migrants, no to the European Union, to vaccinations, no to climate change awareness, and no to military reaction against Russia. It's a strange condition, completely different from the personal perception of the past, of the beginning of the experience of a major integration in this continent. And the generation of populist leaders has a reason reassuring the average voters that they are not the ones at fault, that there are others to blame. This reassuring role was often fulfilled by newcomers, comforting, sometimes even mother-like figures like Giorgia Meloni or Alice Weidel or the new possible candidate to the French presidency, Marine Le Pen. I don't mean to suggest that this is harmless at all. Some may remember a book written by a German publicist telling the story of Hitler's rise to power, Sebastian Haffner, describing the euphoria and excitement on the streets of Berlin in 1933 as people felt liberated from the responsibilities of freedom and the burden of democracy. What I want to convey is that embracing scenarios about the demise of Europe, the end of European society, in a way is a dangerous way to consider things that are underway in Europe. From this point of view, the fact that almost 2/3 of the elected members in the European Parliament are in favor of tighter European integration, that the next president of the Commission will likely be a woman with experienced political positions, and that the majority coalition underpinning the European Commission is a traditional one, well, these are all reassuring factors that might wind up diffusing the aggressive, disruptive rhetoric of extreme far-right parties.
Thank you, Carlo, for that note and dose of optimism, reminding us that EPP, European People's Party, is still the largest group within European Parliament. It's a traditional conservative party, but some of the issues you have raised about European discontent very much resonate here in this country when we try to understand the sort of rise of MAGA movement and the unsettling aspect of it when it comes to traditional politics. So I want to turn back to Constanza because there are winners and losers in this election. Let's unpack that. But one clear winner seems to be Ursula von der Leyen, who was the boss in Europe, basically, over the past 5 years. She's the head of the Commission, the powerful executive body. And what do the results mean for her and for her future within Europe?
I think for Ursula von der Leyen right now, this is an occasion for relief, right? There was a lot of back and forth speculation about whether she would be successful in her bid for a second term as EU Commission President. And there was even some not entirely causeless speculation whether her own German Christian Democrats would be willing to support that bid, right? There were conditions made, suggestions were floated. If you read the German press attentively, you saw that Ursula von der Leyen had a little bit of reason to be nervous. Then she was also very much criticized for, as the polls predicting a rise of the hard right increased, suggesting to Giorgia Meloni that it might be who is the Prime Minister of Italy, that it might be possible for her grouping to enter into a cooperation or coalition with her. That was something that other political, especially the sort of, if you will, the more liberal conservatives in Germany and elsewhere really took offense at. But right now, with the solid showing that her own conservatives had in the German part of the elections, I think her role is relatively assured. Never say never. There can always be upsets in European politics. And again, I want to remind people that we still have that floating number that is quite unusually high of 108 of those 720 legislators who don't yet belong to a political grouping. So I think what we're seeing now and seeing first evidence of is the sort of intense political horse trading that happens in Brussels after elections. And I think some of that horse trading unusually will also now apply to the composition of these coalitions in the European Parliament.
Anna, let me turn to you. You are the farthest away from Europe, in California. But of course, you've been keeping an eye not just on European politics, but on its eastern flank. But give us your main takeaway. How does all of this conversation on moderates versus far right, how does it look to you as someone who's focused a lot on democracy and authoritarianism in Europe?
Well, for a change, I too get to be an optimist.
Oh, great.
So what we've seen, in Poland and Hungary and in Slovakia is a pretty poor showing for the populist right wing. A lot of attention has been focused on Hungary and the sort of upstart new opposition that's basically taken second place. Fidesz, the right-wing populist, got its worst showing ever. In Poland, the incumbent government, which is also a liberal conservative party, also did well. And the big surprise was Slovakia, where the party of, there's a populist right-wing party that was in power, also took second place. So overall, there's this sort of resurgence of the moderates, basically, both in the opposition and the government, which is very welcome news for the future of democracy in this region, since, as Constanze pointed out, these really are referenda on the current governments.
Anna, how do you explain that? Here we're talking about the lurch to the far right in Western Europe and talking about an effort to reclaim the center and liberal core in Eastern Europe.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that voters in these countries have just gotten sick and tired of these populist right-wing parties. In Hungary, the big message was corruption and the corruption of the government. And the new opposition party that did so well would know, since its leader was part of Fidesz, the incumbents at one point. In Slovakia, it was a disgust with foreign policy, and basically that party's kind of sidling up to Russia. And in Poland, I think it was a reassertion of keeping, it was a very close result, but in the end, it was kind of a reassertion of the moderates. It has to be noted, though, that, in Poland, for example, the party that came in third is an extreme right-wing party whose stated goal is, and I quote, to get Ursula von der Leyen. So it's not all roses, but I think in general, it's sort of an electorate that's sort of tired of the rhetoric and the corruption of the right-wing populists and wants to sort of reassert a more middle course.
It seems important to pause here and talk a bit more about what's happening in Hungary, because Viktor Orban has very much positioned himself as sort of the brain behind this international illiberal movement, has been coming and going to the United States, meeting with Donald Trump, and has a full fleshed out theory of a Christian nation and so on. But he's now facing an opponent, quite a strong one for the first time. Can you tell us who he is and what it means for politics in Hungary?
So the upstart opponent is a man named Péter Magyar. The party's called TISA. They only came on the political scene in February, so this is really an upsurge. Magyar himself was very much part of Fidesz earlier on, in its earlier incarnation, and left the party. And his main message has been of, we are sick and tired of the corruption. And the untold story about Orban is that he has been using European funding to basically asset strip the economy, to nationalize many of the key economic sectors, and to build in all kinds of corrupt advantages for himself and his allies. So on one hand, there was a message of corruption. On the other hand, there's the fact that there's still a whole bunch of frozen funds from the European Union, and they're frozen because of rule of law violations by the Orban government. And Magyar's argument was basically, enough of this, right? Enough of the corruption, enough of the sanctions, let's return to normalcy. And for its part, the governing party didn't do a very good job of addressing these concerns at all. They sort of spoke about their attacks on the EU. They talked about Euroscepticism, when most Hungarians still support EU membership, and they very much want to be a normal part of the EU, receiving EU funding, of course, rather than be a pariah within the European Union. So I think that was the effective message, basically. Let's stop being the pariahs. Let's get rid of the corruption. Let's get rid of the sanctions that are imposed on us because of rule of law violations. And you know exactly who to blame, and that's Orban and Fidesz. And that proved to be a really effective message. So Fidesz got something like 2 million votes. TISA got 1.3, which for a party that hasn't been around 4 months ago is an amazing result.
Can I add something to this?
Please do. I was just going to note that Hungary is about to assume
exactly
EU presidency. Constanza?
Yeah, that's what I wanted to add, and that there is so much concern at this point in both within the EU and within NATO about Hungary's often not just unconstructive but disruptive or destructive role in voting. It very often vetoes votes, especially on support for Ukraine, and blocks other initiatives. And there is a movement afoot by the Eastern European countries, the B9, B after Bucharest, which is the capital of Romania, and one of those 9 countries of Eastern and Central Europe, to throw Hungary out from the grouping. So, in other words, there too there's a great deal of movement in and around a country that was once a solid member of the European Union and NATO. And finally, I mean, there is a transatlantic angle to this as well, in that Orban's Hungary and what he has done with Hungary, which is to basically end checks and balances, institute a one-party state, and end the separation of church and state, as you said, Asli, sort of institute really white Christian ethno-nationalism as a principle of governance. That's the avowed model for the American MAGA right. That's why Orban always gets invited to CPAC conferences and interviewed by Tucker Carlson, and he's the hero. So all of this movement here, has an impact, or will be watched very closely by the American hard right.
I think we should spend a bit of time on what all this means with a Trump presidency over the horizon. But before we get to that, let me turn to Carlo again, and sticking to personality analysis here. Tell us about Giorgia Meloni. She's about to host G7. She came into power as a far-right name, but has become more or less a kingmaker. What do the election results mean for her rule in Italy and within the European space? And is she going to support, for example, Ursula von der Leyen?
Yes, this is essentially what we expect, that she will show her support for von der Leyen. I must admit her popularity is more solid and stable than I expected 2 years ago. Italians seem to appreciate her style, which is both cheerful and assertive, sometimes even rude. She has a unique way of speaking, likely inherited from her family of actors, and she uses these skills to come across as a friendly yet strong figure, commanding attention in every room. I wouldn't say she's really governing the country, but she heavily influences the public opinion. Media people are partly intimidated, and there are several signs of autocracy light. She's not really doing things because the government program had already been formulated before she took office as part of the negotiation for the post-COVID EU financial support. Consider that Italy is currently using an unprecedented fiscal stimulus amounting to 20% of its GDP, which is obviously keeping the economy afloat, making Meloni's job much easier. She has gained strength from the European elections, but now that it's halftime, halfway through the term, she needs to focus on pushing through at least one of her two major projects. The first involves a constitutional reform that would give more power to the prime minister, take a lot away from the president of the republic, an extremely dangerous reform. The second project is to create a large unified party of the right. Not easy if you think that the three coalition parties belong to three different European formations. But this process is indispensable because this fragmentation of her own camp, of her own governance coalition, makes Meloni much less agile in the European arena. If she can make progress on these reforms, she will struggle in the midst of an electorate that remains unpredictable and disillusioned. But before moving on the domestic front, she must wrap up the European situation. And this will only be possible once we see what happens in France.
I see.
The rise of Le Pen as a leader poses a challenge and puts pressure on Meloni. She may be tempted to move to the center, gain recognition as a strong conservative leader, or yield to the call of the wild and return to her original neo-fascist or far-right beliefs that Le Pen now embodies. And I doubt it's an easy relation between the two. But I don't want to take too much time. I'm following very closely this relation between Meloni and Le Pen, and I think it's very interesting, very telling of what is coming down the road.
So it looks like we'll be talking about three women in Europe's future over the next few years: Meloni, Marine Le Pen, and Ursula von der Leyen. Anna, let me turn to you and bring Ukraine into this conversation. Ukraine was not on the ballot. It seems to me that particularly ruling parties were very cautious about not making it about Ukraine. But the opposition far-right parties have used Ukraine plenty. But what do the results mean for Europe's resolve in supporting Ukraine? Is there any particular Ukraine readout from the election results?
I think one thing to say is that, Ukraine did become an issue in some East European countries, right? So in Slovakia, for example, it's the reason why the governing party did as badly as it has. I think precisely because the EPP, the European People's Party, will continue.
Can you explain that? Meaning,
sure. I think Slovakia has always been sort of ambivalent about Russia and about support for Ukraine, but the opposition very effectively portrayed this as basically a betrayal of European values. That we Slovaks are Europeans, and to do that, you don't sidle up to the biggest bully in European politics. What you do instead is you reaffirm your commitment to Europe, and that proved an effective message. I think there's definitely room there's still a lot of support for Ukraine. More broadly, the fact that the European People's Party and so the moderate center is still holding is going to mean that the policy on Ukraine is unlikely to shift all that much. There will be, of course, a lot of questioning from the far-right parties. It's clear that these are very sort of troubling results for Ukraine that way. But I'd also point out that Scholz did really badly. The man who slow-walked aid to Ukraine in the popular perception was also punished in these elections. And so one way to interpret that, at least one way that it's being interpreted in Eastern Europe, is that this is sort of another sort of reaffirmation of support for Ukraine. That might be wishful thinking, but nonetheless, I'm seeing more questioning from the far right, but the center is still holding.
I think France might be different.
That's right.
We're opposite of that, but Constanza, Traffic Coalition has done poorly. I mean,
German Traffic Light Coalition, yes.
And Traffic Light Coalition, sorry. Tell us why and how poorly, and in particular, if you could explain why the Greens have been the biggest losers of this cycle.
All right, that's a complicated question. I'll do my best. And I will also engage another piece of relentless self-promotion and say, yes, there will be a piece from me out shortly that explains all that in more details.
Great.
For viewers who don't want to take notes. But again, there's a European level to this and a national level. But let me start off with the numbers. In numeric terms, the winner is the CDU with about 30%, together with its Bavarian sister party, the CSU. Then the second largest party is the Alternative for Germany, and the traffic light coalition together of Chancellor Olaf Scholz's Social Democrats, the Greens and the Liberals, in other words, a center-left coalition, together got a terrible showing. The SPD lost a couple percentage points. The Greens lost, I think, 8.6, which is disastrous. And the Liberals stayed more or less equal. The other winner that needs to be mentioned here is the new party of the left-wing populist firebrand Sarah Wagenknecht, who took a splinter group away from the old Die Linke party, a successor to the post-communists in the GDR. She founded that party in December. It is like few parties in Europe, and in fact, no other parties in Germany, called after herself, the Alliance Sarah Wagenknecht. And they got a really remarkable more than 6% at the first try. Now, at the European level, the fact that the Christian Democrats sort of were more or less stable, plus about a little less than 2 percentage points, means that has a significant stabilizing impact on the role of their coalition, the EPP, the European People's Party transnational grouping in the parliament. And that means, again, that's one of the reasons why, or a key reason why Ursula von der Leyen is now on track to win her bid for a second term. At the national level, things are slightly more confusing. And that is where the smackdown, the drubbing for the traffic light coalition becomes more important. Unlike France, nobody is suggesting, except in a sort of kabuki game, which isn't serious, that there should be new elections. For one, the German Constitutional Court has told future chancellors in no uncertain terms, after Gerhard Schröder tried this one in 2005, to never again call a vote of confidence on themselves if they just want an election to get a bigger majority. This was a sort of do not ever do this again sort of judicial opinion. So while the members of the opposition, the CDU and the hard right, are now suggesting that Schröder should call a vote on himself, he has no reason to do that, and very narrow constitutional pathways to do that. There is a second option, which is the constructive vote of no confidence, which the opposition leader can call. But then the opposition leader needs two things. He needs to know he has a majority, and that means that the Conservatives, now headed by Friedrich Merz, would have to have a coalition. That's a problem, because that coalition would take at least one party. If it's the Social Democrats, they're currently fielding a chancellor. Highly unlikely that they're going to do that, right? That leaves the Greens and the Liberals. They might not even be enough. And also the CDU hasn't yet actually proclaimed who its chancellor candidate will be, because we still have 3 Eastern elections in the fall in which the AfD trends in first place everywhere. And the CDU might need a fall guy for that. So they have decided to make that decision only later at the beginning of winter. And so that's not going to happen. But the truth is that the rise of the AfD does sort of make the atmosphere very, very tense. I think it's highly likely that even if, as I say, I don't think the government's going to fall or there will be elections, but you're going to look at a really nervous and inward-looking spate of mainstream German parties at a time when you would want energetic German leadership in Europe in a time of crisis. So, sorry, you asked why the Greens have done so badly. I think that's very, very simply explained. It's a combination of sort of very maximalist proposals on climate change mitigation laws, including the famous heat pump law, some very ill-advised and naive nepotism, and simply sort of amateurish governance mistakes, right? And I think that has demystified or taken the magic away from the Green Party in Germany, which was a high flyer until very recently. And this despite the fact that their cabinet ministers remain, I think by most people's judgment, the most talented within the current German political roster.
So the anti-green sentiment seems to be there in several other countries as well. Clear rebuke for EU's ambitious Green Deal agenda. Carlo, I wonder what it means for the European Commission. What message are they going to take? Does it mean they dilute their incredibly ambitious green transformation agenda, or how do they manage the situation in which there's a weak government in France and in Germany?
A great question, but it's much too early to say. We don't have a precise configuration of the EU institutions yet, so we don't know who will take. My best guess is that the Brussels institutions, essentially Parliament, Commission, and partly some part of the councils, will support the big agenda. That means the big topics of Ursula von der Leyen's agenda, whether with Ursula or not. But that means concentrating on the defense system, technological and digital transition, and the enlargement. And leaving social policies, migration, and other topics to the member states. That would grant some support to the workings, the ambitious workings in the real vital agenda. The critical point might exactly be a rollback in green policies. This is a gray zone where centralization of policies or decentralization of competences may produce a lot of tension, and I'm actually not in the condition to see what happens. Basically, the Commission might play a role of mediation, but this depends on two factors. The first is leadership, and this connects to what Constanze told us about Germany. If you allow me, I will come to this point briefly, and the other is money. When it comes to leadership, there is a challenge. The president of the EU Commission will come from the European Popular Party, and currently there is no major member states that is governed by the European Popular Party. Currently, the party sits on the opposition benches in Germany, France, and Spain. It's only the third junior party in Italy's coalition. And this is an unprecedented situation that will lead to conflicts between the Commission and the Council. And I do not think that the next president will have an easy time, at least until September 2025, when a new CDU chancellor is likely to take over and to take office. And in that case, you have again an alignment between Council, Commission, Brussels institution, the major state. We don't know what will happen with France, of course, but Macron will stay as president. And I suspect we're a bit confused now, but in 2025, things may look more clearly. The other point is money, and obviously I'm not sure it's an interesting topic, but I find it very interesting because it will rein in the radicalization of French politics. France and Italy are conditioned over the stability of their fiscal situation. And France's national debt has just been downgraded by Standard & Poor's, so they cannot. The new government in France cannot try to break free from the common rules, or it will be punished by by their own financial conditions.
So we have a question that came from our online viewers about one that is about the impact of all this on foreign policy, specifically EU policy towards Russia. I want to change that question, Anna, a little bit and ask you what Vladimir Putin is thinking when he looks at the election results. Is he happy? Is he unhappy? Give us your answer.
I'm sure he's delighted by the results in both Germany and in France, and in Italy, frankly. I think
Explain it a little bit.
So, because Marine Le Pen and Bardella did so well in France, this is a party that has been, in effect, funded by Putin, or politicians have been funded by Putin for quite some time. Le Pen tried very hard to distance herself from Putin, but that just may be window dressing more than anything else. She is still seen as someone who basically, whose views very much align with his. In Germany, again, this is the fact that the AfD did as well as it did, again, is, as far as Putin is concerned, basically a boon. And, I think in Italy, the situation is more complicated because Giorgia Meloni has not been sort of, favoring Putin very much. In fact, she spoke out in favor of Ukraine and against Putin on several occasions. But nonetheless, the fact that that entire grouping has been strengthened in the European Parliament, I think is something that he very much appreciates. When it comes to the eastern part of Europe, he didn't get the results that he wanted. Obviously, in Poland, Hungary, and in Slovakia, there's either strong consensus on support for Ukraine and against Russia, as there is in Poland, or parties that favored Putin basically did worse, as in Hungary and in Slovakia. But overall, I think, especially with the sort of the earthquake in France, I'm sure he's rather pleased.
Constanza, as Anna is pointing out, there's the emergence of a European political movement that is more pro-Russian and seems to be increasingly vocal about wanting to stop supporting Ukraine. AfD in Germany is an example of that, as Marine Le Pen is clearly an example of that. There are other smaller parties, I think, in Italy, definitely in Netherlands and significant European countries. What is the Ukraine debate in Germany? And how did it factor into this election, if at all?
Let me maybe respond to Anna, if I may, very briefly, because I think she's just raised a really, really important point, which is, there were all these. It was fashionable to say, until quite recently, that the Eastern Europeans and their sort of insistence on nationalism and on national member state prerogatives, their insistence on Christianity as a sort of central factor of the way that they understood their polities, was in fact an expression of the future of Europe, right? And that they would be the trendsetters in this, and that the Western Europeans would follow this. There's a whole book about this by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes, right? The Light That Failed. And I think this election outcome, I think, sort of sets a counter argument to that, which would be, I think, really quite interesting to explore. And will be interesting to watch in its political ramifications. And it sort of shows that liberalism in Eastern Europe does maybe have deeper roots than people are willing to think, and that it is also very much attached to the European Union. That said, the fact that the elections in France and in Germany have gone as they have means really that the Franco-German motor, which for a while now has not been enough to set the pace or even the direction of travel within Europe, I think really, has been given yet another sort of crippling blow, right? And what that means is that a Europe that really very badly needs to have among the member states, a conversation about its future in a darkening geostrategic environment with the Russians engaged in kinetic warfare on its periphery, with Chinese interference and espionage, and with an American ally that might turn hostile again after the next election. That raises real questions, not just about the way that member states work with each other at the intergovernmental level, right? But also about whether the European Union, in the way that it is currently constructed, is fit for purpose, right? Does it need more active, a more energetic role, or maybe even more competences in fields such as defense? Does it need the completion of capital markets union? I have heard venture capitalists say, I need that in order for investing in defense as a private actor to become, a viable proposition for me, etc. And I see these are architectural discussions that so far, really, Emmanuel Macron in France has been the only one to really push, and that the Germans and the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz have been very reluctant to engage with. And I think this is the moment, as far as I'm concerned, for other Europeans, and especially the Eastern Europeans, to step up their efforts and to articulate their own vision of where this should go. I would really like to see them do that, and I think it would provide for more political balance. And also, it's their right, I've never liked to have a European Union at 27, where the Western Europeans and the founding nations were the ones who sort of expected others to follow their leadership. I think that is no longer acceptable in this current moment. I'm sorry, Asa, you had another question, which I think I didn't answer.
So, let me take it from here. As you said, Macron has been raising the alarm bell about what all this means for Europe's future, EU's future specifically. This week, he said the rise of the nationalists and demagogues is a danger for our nation and for Europe. But I want to ask about another danger, or another issue, which is all three of you. We have a few minutes left, but I wonder how the prospect of a Trump presidency changes this equation. What does it mean for these trend lines that you've talked about if there is a second Trump administration in November in this country?
Anna,
you're the part.
I think it'll concentrate the minds of Europeans, right? It's, I think there's nothing better than a crisis for resolving collective action dilemmas. And I think this can sort of definitely bring heads together that otherwise would not have come together. I would also say that this, as Constanza points out, would strengthen the position of people like Orban and others, who now will have basically a bigger stage and a bigger international forum to speak from. It may very well do the same thing for the other right-wing populists across Europe. But I think more than anything, this represents a huge opportunity for the European Union to resolve some of the issues that Constanza was talking about, and to start thinking seriously about what it means to be Europe, not one that's always referring to the United States, but one that's basically has to resolve and put its internal house in order first.
So on an optimistic level, it triggers some type of a soul searching in Europe. On a more pessimistic level, the likes of Orban will really have a powerful friend and a bigger platform. Carlo, how do you see the effects of Trump presidency, possible Trump presidency?
Well, connecting the results of the elections with what can happen in a few months, what is the result of these elections? Essentially that the European Council, where the heads of government seat, has gained salience in respect with the European Parliament or the European Commission. And within the European Council, the logic is often a transactional one. That means that this kind of variable alliances and opportunistic behavior will probably be the name of the game. The presence of nationalist governments make it more difficult to advance plausible proposals for sharing, for instance, financial resources. I do not see the next EU Commission propose to the EU Parliament to approve a larger EU budget. And I guess, unfortunately, we can also forget the capital markets union and the banking union, and of course, neither public debt mutualization or common tax collection. So at the end of the game, it will be a transactional game among heads of governments. And in this respect, the things that Trump can sell or buy will be part of this transactional game. It's not very inspiring, but it's a sort of lesson that will need to be learned.
Constanza, let me turn to you. It sounds like there'll be more of a tendency for bilateral relations, striking deals with United States. Is it a repeat of the first Trump administration? Is it worse? Is it better? What are the possible effects on these trend lines?
Right. Well, that's another complicated question, and and we only have 3 more minutes. Very briefly, I feel like European countries tried pretty much everything. So sucking up to Trump, keeping their distance, and bilateralizing relations. And I think all 3 of those strategies failed in one way or another, simply because of the unpredictability and in some cases, at least the German case, outright hostility, right, that the president felt towards them. And so I think there is really only one way, as far as I'm concerned, that it is possible to Trump-proof this period, especially because in the Trump administration between 16 and 20, we had a mercurial president surrounded by mainstream conventional advisors. This time it is very different. You have an even more mercurial president surrounded by advisors who are well organized and well prepared, and who in some ways are more ideological and hardline than he is, whereas he's much more transactionalist. And so I think the only way to preserve European agency, I don't dare speak of autonomy, against this potentiality really is for Europeans to exercise solidarity with each other, right? To not be trapped in prisoners' dilemmas, to work with each other, to take care of each other's vulnerabilities. And that, as far as I, as a committed European, would say, is also what we should be doing for each other anyway. That goes very much to the address of my own country, Germany.
Thank you, Constanza. That is a great place to end this conversation. I'd like to thank you all, Carlo Bastasin, Anna Grismauer Busse, and Constanza Stelzenmüller, and of course our listeners for joining this very fascinating discussion on the future of Europe. This is Aslı Taşbaş, and goodbye from Brookings, CUSE, Central and United States in Europe.
Thanks.